From Fox 8, this is breaking news.
Good evening, I'm Meg Gatto.
And I'm Liz Reyes. Minutes ago, a hearing on the NOPD consent decree wrapped up.
The hearing focused on the NOPD's internal investigation into a former member of the mayor's security detail. David Jones is live at federal court.
Meg and Liz, no members of the NOPD were present during today's hearings. The city did send an attorney to represent their interests, though. The main point of today was for the consent decree monitors to present to federal Judge Susie Morgan as well as the public their findings from the review of the Public Integrity Bureau's investigation of NOPD officer Jeffrey Vappy. The monitors noted the PIB investigation began after a series of Lee Zurich investigations. The investigation looked into time spent by Vappy and the mayor in a city-owned apartment. The monitors said their review of PIB's investigation found 9 different violations of the consent decree and NOPD policy. They say they found multiple violations of the consent decree happening with the investigation. The review suggested the appearance of favoritism within PIB, and they expressed concerns that if PIB, according to them, couldn't get it right on such a high-profile investigation, then they could be missing items when it comes to other investigations. The city's response to the monitor was also slammed by DOJ attorneys. The city maintains the PIB investigators were under pressure by the monitor and still completed a thorough and accurate investigation. The mayor was asked about the monitor's findings today. Let's take a listen.
Stay in their lane, stay focused on the consent decree, and if we do that, and if they do that, they will get to the place where I am. I know that we're at a place of substantial completion, and of course, when you think about just some of the areas that they're zoning in on in terms of bias-free policing is one of them, and then getting outside of the lane relative to investigations, and being biased, it gives me great concern.
The monitors noted that the PIB did not include payroll fraud as an allegation in its intake paperwork, which they say broke several paragraphs of the consent decree and tainted this investigation from the beginning. Reporting live at federal court, David Jones, Fox 8, Local First.